Greetings, everyone. Sego Seo Guego. I'm Karen Lewis, and I'm here with Trish Ray for Jijunha Ongawana Language and Cultural Awareness Month. And our topic is From the Valley to the Simcoe Deed, and this is part one. Trish is a longtime researcher for Mohawk's Bay of Quinte. And so our journey from Mohawk Valley in what is now New York State. From there to shores of Bay of Quinte and Tyinenega Mohawk territory. And I've heard the story, of course, many times, but no matter how many times I hear it, I always get some new understanding from each one. And so it was a difficult, long, perilous journey, and such an important part of our history. And well, I hope if you have heard the story before that you get something new from this our little talk today. And if it's your first time hearing it, then I thank you for your interest.
Okay. Ready to roll?
Ready. Rock and roll.
Okay. There you go, everyone. The talk has been done before, but I think you're right, Karen. I think you do get something new. And I think of the people who have been to Mohawk Valley when we do this, and I think of the people who might plan when travel is allowed, that they plan to go. And someday I hope I was close, but I wasn't exactly there. So someday I'm going to get there too. So we're calling it From the Valley to the Simcoe Deed because next month marks the 236th anniversary of the landing on the shores of the Bay of Quinte, the very beginning of the community that comes to be known as the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. And next March months that. This March months the 227th anniversary of the Simcoe Deed itself. So that's the document granting the original lands of the Mohawk Tract at the Bay of Quinte to the chiefs, warriors, women, and people of the Six Nations. That's what the deed says. So today, we're going to retrace the steps that led the Fort Hunter Mohawks from the Mohawk Valley in 1777, the time that they spent at Lachine during the American Revolution, and then the arrival at the Bay of Quinte in 1784, and finally the granting of the Simcoe Deed in 1793. But it is a big, messy, complicated story, so we decided we're going to divide it into two. So this is the first part, leaving Mohawk Valley, Lachine, and arriving at the Bay of Quinte. So we're going to start in the time of the American Revolution.
So in March and April of 1776, there was a council held at Onondaga, and the position taken by the Confederacy was strict neutrality. However, individuals amongst the nations did choose to support the Americans or the British. The people of the Mohawk Nation tend to support the British. They had a long-standing relationship, but it was not uniform. There were neutral Mohawks and probably American sympathizers as well.
In January of 1777, sadly, 3 principal sachems died at Onondaga. And when that happened, the central fire of the Confederacy was covered. The question of whether or not the Confederacy as a whole would change the position of neutrality was not brought to the central fire again. So for the remainder of the war, it was up to each individual to decide whether they were going to support the Crown, try to remain neutral, or to support the other side.
So in the summer of 1777, Joseph Brant, and I think I understand he was kind of a great orator. He was actively seeking warriors to follow him in service of the king. Captain John Deseranju, or Yodeserunju, meaning the lightning has struck, also chose to ally with the king. British military was offering the hatchet. Those who took up this hatchet were agreeing to fight with the British. And I guess the meaning of that name is taken from Draper manuscripts.
That's right. from Reverend Isaac Barefoot. Draper did ask a language person
Okay.
to do that, so that's in there. So in August of 1777, there was a siege at Fort Stanwix. Just outside of Fort Stanwix, there was a battle called the Battle of Oriskany. The British were laying siege with their allies, including Mohawks, Senecas, Mississaugas, and other Western Indians. The Americans and the Oneida were coming to relieve the siege. Molly Brant found out about this intelligence gathering, let them know, and so those allied with the British and the British ambushed the American forces at Oriskany. And it was a horrible, ferocious, bloody, hand-to-hand combat place. Many warriors were killed. Many significant Seneca leaders were killed. And of course, at this battle, the Great Peace was broken.
In September 1777, the American forces and Oneida allies then attacked the communities of the Mohawks, including Fort Hunter. The Fort Hunter community was a prosperous one. The Mohawks there had rich farmland, abundant livestock, and food supplies, and nice houses. On the whole, they lived more comfortable lives than their neighbors. The American militia encouraged the Oneida to plunder Mohawk communities. Both were happy to loot Fort Hunter and Canajoharie, take the animals, burn the crops. The Mohawk chapel was looted by the Americans and then used as a tavern and a stable. As the American Revolution was in full swing, who was living at Fort Hunter? It would have been the very young, the women, elderly men, and anyone trying to remain neutral. The warriors would be in and out of the community on scouts or in skirmishes.
So the next section is actually leaving Mohawk Valley. So after the Battle of Oriskany, late August until about October 1777, the community at Fort Hunter was forced to leave Mohawk Valley. If they had stayed, they would have been under repeated attacks by the Americans and the Oneidas. But not all the families left at once. They left in waves. When they did move out, American families moved right into the houses. The largest group that left was a group of elderly women, children, and about 50 warriors. They left Fort Hunter to go to the Hudson River, seeking the protection of Burgoyne's army, British commander. Captain John de Zarontier organized the move with the help of Captain Isaac Hill and Anadegia Johannes. So there was a group of 6 or 7 families that refused to leave at that time, and they were forced to leave later.
Garon Yagigoa, or Big Clear Sky, also known as David Loft, and a small party of men set off to locate the Mohawks and guide them. Near Saratoga, they were attacked, and Captain John was wounded. Captain Isaac Hill's brother was killed. Big Clear Sky was not Mohawk. Peter John called him a Stockbridge Indian, and another source called him a St. Francis Indian, but he is the ancestor that brought the Loft name to the Bay of Quinte. The group of 150 left the area of Saratoga in late September or early October in several family-based groupings. Some went by way of Fort Edward, that's south of Lake George, and were captured. About 50 of them were captured. They were rescued the next year. The main group, of now about 100, made it to Ticonderoga in mid to late October 1777. They crossed Lake Champlain in boats to a place called St. John's, and then north to Lachine. It's so interesting, like going over that part, because I've been there, right? So I'm picturing Lake George and Ticonderoga, and I don't know, it just makes it all real.
2 other people were involved in guiding people. Peter Brant and his brother Brant were Delaware, and they also helped to guide people to Lachine. Brant was wounded in the move to Lachine, and these Brants, in particular, we believe Peter Brant, is the origin of the Brant surname among the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. Most people can trace themselves back to that line of Brants. Even though Joseph Brant's son, Joseph Brant Jr., married into the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, he did not have any sons. So as a surname, it didn't come from that. About 100 years later, just shy of that, I guess, Lyman Draper, the historian and collector of stories, contacted members of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte to get their stories, including ones about leaving the valley. So we're going to go through a few of the testimonies here. The first one is from Lydia Martin, and she was the granddaughter of Captain Isaac Hill and Lydia John, and the mother of Dr. Aronyadeka.
When the war broke out, the Mohawks resolved to take the king's side, and all the nation started, save for a few families. Mrs. Martin thinks only 3 remaining, for Lachine, where they would be safe. As Brant was most the object of Americans, he was placed in front, and all trudged along. Mrs. Martin's mother was then but 3 years old, and of the party, and used to relate, she remembered, they would stop at some of the houses by the way and get buttermilk. The only food they took with them was parched cornmeal, called in the Mohawk onoquitsara, of which each carried as much as he could. I said that with a question mark because I'm not sure if I said it right, but they were pursued by the Americans, and 6 Mohawk women, lagging behind with their heavy loads, were overtaken and made prisoners, and were put in prison and kept a long time, suffering much during their incarceration. Mrs. Martin knew one of these women at Bay of Quinte. The few Mohawk families that were left on the Mohawk, Mrs. Martin says, were compelled to join the others, and she thinks before the close of the war. One of these lagging families was named Claus.
Our second testimony is from Mrs. Margaret Green Moses, and she would have been the daughter of old John Green, who was a veteran of the American Revolution.
The braves in the rear guarding the women and children, John Green among them, were pursued a considerable distance. 6 Mohawk women and 1 child were taken by the Americans. One, afterwards Mrs. Seth Powless, who lived to be aged. The party suffered greatly for want of provisions.
And the next testimony is from Chief Thomas Green, who was the son of old John Green.
The Americans wanted the Mohawks to remain at their homes and take no part in the war, but so firmly attached were they to the king that they would not listen to this advice. They started to retire in a body to Canada. Captain John was in the rear to protect the women and children. They were overtaken and attacked on the way, and those in front fell back to aid the rear guard, and Captain John was wounded. The retreating Indians became nearly starved. Children would cry of hunger. Camped out, and the Indian hunters went out in every direction to hunt, killing only a few birds and made them into gruel, so as to go as far as possible, but afforded the hungry scarcely a spoonful apiece, with small bits of the scanty meat. They were then nearly 2 days' travel to Lachine, and without food. The journey was tardy, as the children who could had to walk in their enfeebled condition, and the smaller ones had to be carried.
The next testimony is from Mrs. Elizabeth Hill Loft Powless, the daughter of Catherine Hill and John Loft, who was the son of David Loft. She was also the granddaughter of Captain Isaac Hill and Lydia John being Captain John's sister.
Okay. There were a few men to guide the women and children. American Indians followed and overtook them and killed some. Once on an island, and killed 3 of their number. One, Margaret Pinn, who married Seth Powless when young, was captured and kept prisoner a while, and finally got to the Seneca chief, Ganquacta, and stayed some time. She was 15 when she found her surviving kindred, 2 younger brothers. Those who fled from the Mohawk Valley had only parched corn and suffered every hardship.
And the last testimony today is from Mrs. Ellen Hill Miracle, the daughter of William Isaac Hill and Nancy Crawford, and the granddaughter of Captain Isaac Hill and Lydia John.
The retreat from the Mohawk to Lachine, 3 were killed by pursuing Americans. The Indians ambuscaded in the woods and had a fight when the Americans came up. who were not numerous and were beaten back. Captain Isaac Hill's brother was among the killed. This retreat was in the fall of the year, as the Mohawks had large hogs in their pens fattening. These and their cattle they left behind, hiding in the ground such valuables as they could not carry. These losses were made good by the British government. Now, I want to add, these testimonies were posted at Jijuna Ongawana Facebook page a little earlier in the month.
Great.
I'm not sure all of them, but I think most of them.
And there's the photograph of Lydia Martin there too, right?
Yes, yes.
It's wonderful to have a photograph of someone who actually gave the testimony.
Really?
Thanks to the Smithsonian Institution for saving those and preserving them.
Yes. And sharing.
So the next section of the presentation today is the life at Lachine. From the fall of 1777 to the spring of 1784. Now, we don't have a whole lot of sources that talk about this time, but the sources we do have indicate it was not a pleasurable or comfortable experience. But when they did get to Lachine, they found Daniel Claus. Now, he was an old friend of Captain John's, and he looked after them as best he could. He found them a suitable plot of grounds in the woods near Lachine, where they built huts for themselves, were supplied with food and clothing during the winter. And then in the following spring, they started to make gardens for planting their own crops. The next winter, they moved further into the woods for better access to wood and water. The fighting men, the able men in the community would have continued to go out on skirmishes. And that's the women, the children, the older men who were left behind at Lachine trying to keep the community going. They were homesick. They were not familiar with Quebec. And Daniel Claus, Colonel Daniel Claus, he described it as, quote, not a very pleasant settlement, and quote, a melancholy situation. In October of 1778, Claus reports that there was illness in the community due to a lack of good provisions. They had been given poor quality clothing, inadequate food, and too much salt pork, too much of that preserved meat. So really, what a terrible set of conditions. They had lost their homes, their farms, their animals, their community, and they're left struggling in a place that they don't know very well, and not getting the assistance that they really, really need.
In 1779, Captain John raised the issues of redress of grievances, loss of lands, and conditions at Lachine with Colonel Guy Johnson, who was the Indian superintendent. Promises had been made to the Six Nations in 1775. Then Governor Guy Carleton had told them, "Go now and fight for your possessions, and whatever you lose of your property during the war, the king will make up to you when peace returns." In April 1779, Frederick Haldimand, governor and commander-in-chief, recognized Carleton's promise for restoration of the Mohawks and their settlements at the expense of the government, and he committed himself to it.
Yeah, and he said, some of the Mohawks of the villages of Konojahari, Tayan, Darago, and Duago, whose settlements there had been upon account of their steady attachment to the king's service and the interests of government ruined by the rebels, having informed me that my predecessor, Sir Guy Carleton, was pleased to promise, as soon as the present troubles were at an end, that same should be restored at the expense of government, to the state they were in before these broke out, and said promise appearing to me just, I do hereby notify the same and assure them the said promise, as far as in me lies, shall be faithfully executed as soon as that happy time come. We have a promise for restitution. We have a promise to return you to the state that you were in before the war. Mm-hmm. So we have a very interesting document from 1784, which actually lists the things that were lost by the community. So we have a total of the estimate of lands, buildings, grain, cattle, movables, etc., of the Mohawk Indians that fled from General Burgoyne's army at Saratoga to Canada in autumn 1777 and were settled by government in the woods near Lachine. The arable land amounted to a value of 3,185 pounds in New York currency, and that's a lot of money. Buildings, cattle, and movables, etc., 3,011 pounds. Grain left behind in barns and barracks to the value of 234 pounds, 5 shillings. No, excuse me, 5 pence. No shillings, 5 pence.
Pretty
For
precise.
a total of 6,430 pounds, no shillings, and 5 pence. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of money.
The report lists the value of harvested grain left behind: wheat, peas, oats, and Indian corn for Captain John, Captain Isaac, Paul, Suzanne, Marie, Marguerite, Seth, and Louis. It reports the acreage of land and value of the land held by Captain John, Captain Isaac, Prius, Suzanne, Marguerite, Paul, David, Lydia, Lorenz, Maria, Louis, Rhea, Marie, Seth, and Niguin. The report lists the losses of grain suffered by Captain John, Captain Isaac, Paul, Suzanne, Marie, Marguerite, Seth. Well, it's Seth, but it might be Seth, and Louis. The losses amounted to 234 pounds. For example, Captain John lost crops of wheat, peas, oats, and Indian corn. Marguerite lost crops of peas, Indian corn, and oats. The report states the value of lands under cultivation lost by various landholders at Fort Hunter. Captain John, Captain Isaac, Creus. Is that how we say that? I have no idea.
So.
Creus. Suzanne, Marguerite, Paul, David, Lydia, Lorenz, Maria, Louis, Rhea, Mary, and Seth. A total of 583 acres with a value of 2,915 pounds. The report also itemizes losses of personal effect and animals. So Captain John lost a house and barn valued at 125 pounds. Household effects valued at 120 pounds. An English sleigh valued at 10 pounds. A carriage valued at 21 pounds. Plow and harrow valued at 11 pounds. A wagon valued at 6 pounds. 3 horses and 2 cows valued at 47 pounds. 5 large pigs valued at 12 pounds, 40 hens, and a gun valued at 5 pounds, and 5 beaver traps valued at 6. Marguerite lost household effects valued at 180 pounds, including 4 horse and 3 cows valued at 40, 20 hens and piglets and 1 large pig valued at 12, a plow and harrow valued at 14. Jacob lost 3 horses valued at 21 pounds, a gun and all his silverware valued at 14 pounds, his porcelain and other personal effects valued at 21. Their households and farms in Mohawk Valley were substantial and valuable. Just look at this list.
It's amazing. I love the silverware and the porcelain.
Porcelain, yes.
And you have to wonder, maybe he ran a tavern. You know, it could have been that was all his silverware and dishes and stuff.
Okay.
Whoever Jacob was, because we don't know. Yeah. But substantial. I mean, it must have been horrible. They went from that to living in huts in the woods.
Yeah.
Land that they didn't recognize. It's heartbreaking, truly. So they were there for about 7 years through the American Revolution. In 1783, at the end of the Revolution, when the British and the Americans came to terms of peace, their allies, the First Nations allies, were not considered in the negotiations. They weren't considered in the terms of this peace treaty. So the issues of restoration and loss of lands were not part of negotiations for the peace treaty. And justifiably, when the Mohawks found out about this, they were furious that the British took it upon themselves to treaty away lands that weren't theirs. But equally, and maybe more so, more devastating, was the fact they couldn't go back home. They could not, and they knew they couldn't go back home.
Mm.
And they were also furious even that the war had been declared over. It was like it had been done without their consent. How dare you? They wanted to continue the fight. And in a letter from January 1784, Captain John wrote to Daniel Claus about what the cessation of the war meant to his people.
We do not think they have beaten us. Our minds are still strong and determined to carry on the war. The disgrace is almost killing us. We warriors de Garehoga have steadfastly set our minds to fight to the end. We are joined with the king, but you can withdraw if you like, if you can.
Which they did, yeah.
Yeah.
In June 1783, based on the promises that Carleton had made and then later on that Haldimand had made in 1779, he couldn't just say, Haldimand could not just say that Britain intended to act for their security and welfare. Promises had made, land had been lost, animals had been lost, farms had been lost, personal effects, a whole community. So he knew he had to do something. He had to act. In June 1783, he sent the Surveyor General, Samuel Holland, to seek out potential areas of settlement for Six Nation allies. The area around Cataraqui was seen as a potential place of security for the Six Nations to settle, and it was to be the site of a new military post. So that might have been something that would encourage settlement by the Six Nations. The general area was investigated by both Joseph Brant and Captain John. Joseph Brant and his followers chose not to settle in the area, instead choosing to settle in the Grand River area. And Captain John and his followers decided on the Bay of Quinte area. So Captain John said in a letter dated April 1784,
As regards now to where we should settle, some are looking to Oswego, but as for us, right from the first, we have decided to go near Cataraqui. To both moves you have said, let it be done. You have also stated that those who are at Lachine should move away this spring and let no one be left behind. Why the Bay of Quinte area? There are many potential reasons or considerations. Captain John and probably other veterans of the war had no desire to settle close to the Americans. They may have considered that the Grand River lands were too close. As you might imagine, Captain John had a very poor opinion of the Americans. It could have been that there was more security to be gained by communities on either end of the lake, and there's also the connection to the north shore of the lake as the birthplace of the peacemaker. Haldimand was not happy about the split in the Six Nations, but he was committed to their settlement, where they chose to be settled. The British government and the king supported the efforts to address the concerns of the Mohawk allies, who had been dispossessed by the treaty that ended the war. The promise of land at the Bay of Quinte and Grand River to Six Nations people and the need to settle incoming loyalists meant that the Mississaugas, who lived in those areas, had to be considered, and the Crown negotiated surrenders by the Mississaugas to the Crown.
yes, so the Royal Proclamation of 1763 had set the British policy of what to do about Indian lands. And if the lands were going to be settled, they had to be purchased by the Crown from the Indians who lived in the area. So in order to meet the requirement of that policy, they had to send someone, they sent a man called Captain William Crawford to negotiate with the Mississaugas who were living in the area for a purchase of land, for settlement, not just for the allies, the loyalists, whoever needed refuge from this new United States of America. So the so-called Crawford Purchase, it was supposedly dated the 9th of October, 1783. And it has, over the years, they say that it has included all the land from Hastings County up to Glengarry County, including the Bay of Quinte, all the islands in the Bay, Prince Edward County, and the lands up to the Ottawa River. And so this purchase of land from the Mississaugas includes part of the land that becomes the Mohawk Tract. Captain William Crawford, in a letter dated October 1783, said what the Crown was willing to pay for the land. So we don't have an actual treaty. There's nothing on paper per se, but he describes the compensation. Because the Mississauga chiefs demanded clothing for all the families under their care, guns for those who had none, powder and ball for winter hunting, and as much red coarse cloth as will make about a dozen coats and just as many laced hats. He also reported that there were 3 Onondaga chiefs who had come from Montreal who were also present and, quote, approved much of what the Mississaugas had done. So there's a lot of suspicion about this surrender. There's no surviving document. The consideration is a joke. The Mississaugas were not the only ones who lived in this vast area, and they were not the only ones who used that vast area. So there's a lot of complications, but there is ongoing active research about this surrender, so we might know more in the future. It may be that it really didn't cover as huge a chunk of land as that. Well, I hope we find out. I hope we do.
So January 1784, the population, so this community at Lachine, total of 114 Mohawks and 11 Delawares at Lachine.
Yeah.
So that was the number of people that traveled on here then, we could say.
Well, except for the guys who didn't come, except for those who didn't come, right? Yeah.
Not everyone there came here, yeah. It's not nice and neat like that.
It is not nice and neat. And it's interesting to know you had Delawares there. You had Delawares and you had a Stockbridge or a St. Francis Indian. In April 1784, once the decision was made for the Bay of Quinte, Captain John turned to the issues of when they were going to leave Lachine, how much land was going to be set aside, pressing the need for a deed, and other ways they needed help to establish a new community. And there's some talk in the correspondence about only 7,000 acres, but Captain John argued, no, we need more, and we need a deed. So in a letter in Mohawk from the 7th of April, 1784, Captain John said,
"Brother, with regard to what you say, move away this spring and not one be left behind. That is our intention, to move away as soon as the ice is gone. Not one shall be left here, even were you to ask us to stay on. We want to receive the deed from you for the land you gave us, the land where we shall dwell."
As the time for departure grew closer, it was clear that not all the Lachine Mohawks would follow Captain John. Captain Isaac Hill and his family remained behind at Lachine because one of his sons died. And when he did leave with his family, he went to Grand River. John Green also fought in the Revolution. He and his family also went to Grand River first. In both instances, those men did eventually come to the Bay of Quinte, but later on. Captain John wrote to Daniel Claus about getting a teacher for their community. In that letter, he says that it has been decided where they're going and that General Haldeman has told them he will be giving them a deed. In a letter in Mohawk on the 10th of April, 1784, he says,
"With regard to what we wrote you the other day about increasing a little more the size of the land as fixed as Governor Haldeman, the land where we are to settle, we would be made happy to have the matter hastened so as to set our mind definitely at ease. He has said to me, I will give them the paper, the deed. We are now impatient to move away.
So in late April, early May, I don't know how long it would take to do this canoe trip. Captain John and his followers left Lachine for the Bay of Quinte. It's estimated there were 20 to 22 families in several canoes. On the 22nd of May, 1784, according to Captain John, this was the date of the landing. So he's making a speech much later in 1800, referencing what happened at the landing. And this is our earliest description of the landing that we have in our records.
The tribe now here fixed on the place, and another tribe fixed on the Grand River. Colonel Claus wished to know what Indians were going to the Bay of Quinte and what to the Grand River. I told him I meant to set myself down at the Bay of Quinte among the Loyalists and Captain Brant at the Grand River. I informed Colonel Claus I was not fond of going to the Grand River owing to their being so near to the Americans, and told him I thought I could not live in peace so near these people, and made choice of this place as being at a greater distance from them. The Americans are like a worm that cuts off the corn as soon as it appears. Sir John Johnson and Colonel Claus told us on leaving Lachine they were happy we were going to a place we had appointed for ourselves. They hoped we should be happy and live in peace. When we quit Lachine, Captain Isaac and his family thought proper to quit us and go to the Grand River to live there. On the 10th May, 1784, Sir John Johnson and Colonel Claus desired us all to come together. But Captain Isaac paid no attention to what they said, and he separated from us and went to the Grand River. Sir John Johnson and Colonel Claus also told me to guide my people in a proper manner, and as we were going to a country where there were other people, Mississaugas, we ought to cultivate their friendship and live happy together. We arrived here on the 22nd of May and found a great number of the native Mississaugas at this place, who were very glad to see us, and we were happy to be met in so friendly a manner. We then held a council with the Mississaugas and informed them our great father had purchased these lands for us and that we had come to sit down on them.
Oh, that is end of part one. Stay tuned for part two.
Hey.
Anyone who is interested in the sources that we've used for this presentation, we can get you that information. As Karen has mentioned, some of the testimonies from the Draper manuscripts about leaving Mohawk Valley, those have been posted on the TTO Facebook page. And a photograph of Lydia, the mother of Dr. O, is also posted there, so you can have a look at that. Any final comments, Karen?
No, that was great. I love hearing this story, being a part of the retelling. Thank you.
It's so interesting when you find something and you don't know if you'll find anything corroborating. You see something about a letter saying, well, they had nice houses, or they had animals, and they had, and then you find a document that says, wow, they had really nice houses, really nice farms, very successful.
And then to flee on foot and in boats and being pursued besides, it's a frightening thing that they went through to get here.
It is.
That canoe journey from Lachine, we have talked before that. Now, wouldn't it be nice to do that?
Goodness.
Yeah, that's just kind of like a dream, I think. But I think it'd be so amazing, were it possible to reenact that canoe.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we'll meet up again for part two.
Part two is coming down the pike, and do take care, everyone. Be well, keep safe, and Onigawaki.